B. Who decides what is normal? Rogers, Joan Ellison. Psychocircuitry, damaging the brain to save the mind. HarperCollins Publishers, 1992. Page 185-187. Some philosophers, ethicists, lawyers, and psychiatrists argue that even the techniques of psychotherapy used to help people with neuroses or to work through bad times in their lives are methods of controlling people, a way of getting the patient, to do someone else's bidding. The therapist's intensive psychoanalysis, for example, can vastly influence values and attitudes and change people's lives forever, not always as they or their families might wish. Behavioral therapists, disciples of Ivan Pavlov and B.F. Skinner, are highly skilled at extinguishing behaviors, including phobias, anxieties, and inappropriate sexual activity ranging from homosexuality to pedophilia. They do this by reinforcing behaviors they want with rewards of one kind or another, and by not reinforcing or by applying punishments to behaviors they don't want. Diversive therapies, which are very controversial, have applied small, measured, consistent doses of pain to stop even more harmful, in someone's opinion, behavior with great success. But the question is whether those techniques are or can be abused to satisfy the government, an institution, or an individual's desires to control ideas or behavior. Broadly defined, behavioral modification can be said to cure mental disorder, protect the public, protect the person from himself or herself, or make the person easier to live within institutions or outside. Regardless of the goal, profound or trivial, the issue is who decides if someone's behavior should be or can be controlled, who gets treated or not, who controls the means of treatment. A doctor, a psychotherapist, a hospital, the judge, your mother, your spouse, the prison warden, the government. Can these decisions safely stay in the hands of the experts? Can a criminal refuse drugs to tame him even if he is a menace to other inmates or himself? Is he really a menace, or are the guards merely irritated and looking for a way to ease their lives? What if his refusal means he is locked up in solitary confinement? Is that cruel and unusual punishment if he is mentally ill? Who, in this case, is controlling whom? Is Johnny required by the school to take drugs for his hyperactivity as the price of admission, even if his parents believe he is merely a normal, rambunctious boy? What of the private psychiatric hospital that collaborates with parents to commit a teenager who misbehaves? B. Who decides what is normal? Condit, Rogers, Joan Ellison. Psychocircuitry, damaging the brain to save the mind. HarperCollins Publishers, 1992. Condit, the extreme view holds that coercion, or the aura of coercion, the implied threat of retribution, is at play with all patients or prisoners who accept any form of psychiatric intervention. What troubles these critics most, they say, is not that society has a legitimate reason to control the behavior of some people, but that those who own the means of control are not honest, that they have hidden agendas as well. Page 187. In the landmark article on the issue of mind control and psychocircuitry, Willard Galen, MD, told the story of a distinguished brain researcher, probably Jose Delgado, who was describing the potential use of remote control electrode implants in the brain to control antisocial behavior as a humane alternative to imprisonment. Asked whether he would be willing to turn the control box over to the patient who, presumably, wanted to be a good guy, he quickly said no. Why not? Because it's my box, he replied. In the 1970s, no name was more prominent in the mind control debate than that of Jose M.R. Delgado of Yale University School of Medicine. In a dazzling series of experiments on animals using electrical brain stimulation, he demonstrated how simple it is to overwhelm an animal's instincts and will. With his remote control implants, he stopped a bull on a rampaging charge in its tracks with a radio signal that stimulated a part of its brain. Monkeys could be stimulated to constant, intense pleasure. It was Delgado's philosophy and his vision of the future that fed many of the fears that exist today. As writer Maggie Scarf noted in the New York Times, November 15, 1970, Delgado envisioned a psycho-civilized society whose members would influence and alter their own mental functions to create a happier, less destructive, and better balanced man. B. Who decides what is normal? Condit, Rogers, Joan Ellison. Psychocircuitry, damaging the brain to save the mind. HarperCollins Publishers, 1992. Condit, page 188. Delgado invented a machine, called a stimoceiver, that stimulated the brain and received brain wave signals, sending signals on 3 channels and receiving EEG recordings on 3. With the stimoceiver implanted in monkey brains, he could manipulate their anger, rage, hunger, thirst, pleasure, and pain. In a circus-like routine, he could make them repeatedly yawn then growl. He firmly believed that such devices could keep assaultive violent criminals safe enough to walk the streets, and in a book called Physical Control of the Mind, he wrote a dreamy defense of such experiments and activities. Page 189. To critics of psychosurgery, Delgado's work and continuing efforts to map the brain's behavior centers are evidence of the dangers of psychosurgery and other forms of mind control. Civil libertarians quake in their amendments, and even unless dogmatic individuals have reason to feel a chill. Some people, they say, want to control people to their own ends or societies. The medical profession's Hippocratic oath to first do no harm has historically proven to be the best safeguard, leading doctors to withhold dangerous procedures even when they might help, and to avoid putting their skills in service to obnoxious political, experimental, or punitive ends. Those physicians who have done so at the behest of the Nazis during World War II, for example, are exceptions to the long rule of self-discipline and self-policing in the medical professions. They value their profit margin over their Hippocratic oath. See Political Conquering Disguise as Healthcare Finds Maya. The Brain Changers, Scientists and the New Mind Control. New York. Harcourt Brace Jovanovich, include, 1973. In his book Physical Control of the Mind, Toward the Psycho-Civilized Society, Jose M. R. Delgado describes how a patient with electrodes in his brain was forced to close his hand into a fist every time the current passed through a certain spot. The patient did not seem to mind having to make a fist, which he knew was involuntary. But when Delgado asked him to try to keep his fingers extended during the next stimulation, he couldn't do it. As Delgado reports, the patient then said, "I guess, doctor, that your electricity is stronger than my will." Harcourt Brace Jovanovich, include, 1973. Page 42. The interesting fact was that the patient considered the evoked activity spontaneous, and always offered a reasonable explanation for it, writes Delgado. When the patient turned his head, Delgado asked him what he was doing. "I am looking for my slippers," the man said one time. On other occasions he replied, "I heard the noise, I am restless, or I was looking under the bed." This implies not only control over the man's behavior, but the power to make him think that he will what, in fact, was electrically forced on him. Delgado also describes how an otherwise reserved 30-year-old woman reacted to stimulation in one part of her brain. When he pressed the button, she openly expressed her fondness for the therapist who was new to her, kissed his hands, and talked about her immense gratitude for what was being done for her. Such power is frightening enough. Yet what really worries liberals, and some of Delgado's fellow scientists, is not so much what he does as what he says about it. In his book, Delgado urges the government to make conquering the mind the national goal. He foresees a new age in which the brains of human beings can be regulated from a distance, as easily as one can now open or close the doors of a garage by pushing a button in one's car. Natural evolution is too slow, he says. We will have to intervene directly in the fate of man by implanting cerebral pacemakers, similar to cardiac pacemakers, which would maintain people's mental stability at all times and thus preserve peace. Page 43. Some doctors might also go along with Delgado's prescription of cerebral pacemakers to prevent violent behavior, at least in certain extreme cases, see Chapter 9. But when he speaks of using implants to treat such widespread ills as anxiety, fear, and obsessive behavior, he makes all of us possible candidates for brain stimulation. When microminiaturized radio receivers became available, he attached them to the kind of brain implants invented by Walter Hess and gave his subjects total freedom of movement, making it possible to stimulate their brains by remote control. Later on, he replaced the radio receivers with tiny two-way radios, creating the stimoceiver. Now he is deeply involved in 3 projects, embedding the stimoceiver inside the subject's body, to hide it under the skin, linking the stimoceiver to a computer, as he did with Patty, and developing the whole new line of chemical implants. See political conquering disguise. AS Healthcare. Convid Pines. Maya. The Brain Changers. Scientists and the New Mind Control. New York. Harcourt Brace Jovanovich. Include. 1973. Convid. Page 53 to 54. Bridging the span between a man's brain and the computer would be even less of a problem. Even today, epileptic patients' EEGs can be transmitted accurately, via ordinary telephone lines, to specialists 2,000 miles away, and astronauts' brain waves can be recorded in flight, then telemetered back to Earth with the greatest of ease. In brain research, as in jet travel, distance has become nearly meaningless. The closer we come to such remote control of the brain, however, the more logical Delgado's next plan appears. This would eliminate the problem of distance, but in an entirely different manner. Delgado would simply put everything inside the patient, not just the stimoceiver or electrode and its source of power, but the computer as well. Naturally, he would need a very tiny, miniaturized computer, smaller than anything available today, but he is confident that it can be built. Then the whole electronics would be inside the body, he exults. No radio link would be necessary. The process would be going on in a closed circuit, totally inside the subject. The implants, whether electrical or chemical, would be sealed into the brain for good, their action directed by the implanted computer. If the computer's program needed to be changed, one could still have access to it from outside, just as one changes TV channels by remote control. A man with such an implant would feel a compulsion to behave along the lines planned for him. For the rest of his life, the computer would shape him, sending periodic jolts of pain or pleasure directly to his brain, and neither he nor anyone around him would know it. The next decade may see a growing tug of war between those who are seduced by such technology and scientists who realize that they still know far too little about what really happens when one invades the human brain. Psalms 83:15 KJV 1. Keep not thou silence, O God, hold not thy peace, and be not still, O God. 2:4. Lo, thine enemies make a tumult, and they that hate thee have lifted up the head. 3. They have taken crafty counsel against thy people, and consulted against thy hidden one. For they have said, Come, and let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel may be no more in remembrance. 5. For they have consulted together with one consent, they are confederate against thee. Therefore, to my judges and my critics, which includes all psychologists and psychiatrists who claim that I am mentally ill anytime I am not being medicated by their drugs, I declare that I don't have to meet your vague, ever-changing, subjective, unquantifiable, prejudicial standards of conduct toward thought in order to be acceptable, successful, or healthy. I do not need your stingy, begrudging approval in order to be acceptable or to earn to keep my guaranteed freedoms of autonomy, speech and religion. Although I will occasionally fail to perform correctly, and although I am very much human, with human limitations, I still reject your philosophies, your pagan, heathen, anti-Christian PYCHOLOGE, and I demand my legal rights to continue to learn, grow and mature as a Christian, an American, an individual human being, and a student in a psychoactive drug-free classroom of life. I don't have to think like you. I don't have to act like you. You have no right to force me to conform to your desires. I refuse to be a convert proselyte to your drug religion. If you force psychoactive drugs in me again, then you are violating American, UN, and biblical laws. My legal rights concerning the forced receipt of psychoactive drugs and possible surveillance fault-finding tactics employed by the enemies of my family. 1. Protection as an American citizen. Smith, Glenn Young, and Richard A. Mann and Barry S. Roberts. Business Law and the Regulation of Business. St. Paul, West Publishing Company, 1990. Page 57. The First Amendment states, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble. Page 100. False imprisonment. The tort of false imprisonment or false arrest is the intentional confining of a person against her will within fixed boundaries if the person is conscious of the confinement or harmed by it. The restraint may be brought about by physical force, the threat of physical force, or by force directed against a person's property. Page 100. To infliction of emotional distress. One of the more recently recognized torts is that of intentional infliction of emotional distress. One who by extreme and outrageous conduct intentionally or recklessly causes severe emotional distress to another is liable for such emotional distress as well as any resulting bodily harm. Page 104-105. Defamation. The tort of defamation is a false communication that injures the person's reputation by disgracing him and diminishing the respect in which he is held. An example would be the publication of a statement that a person had committed a crime or had a loathsome disease. If the defamatory communication is handwritten, typewritten, printed, pictorial, or in any other form with similar communicative power, such as television or radio, it is designated libel. If it is spoken or oral, it is designated slander. In either case it must be communicated to a person or persons other than the one who is defamed. This is referred to as its publication. Page 107-108. Intrusion is the unreasonable and highly offensive interference with the solitude or seclusion of another. Such unreasonable interference includes improper entry into another's dwelling, unauthorized eavesdropping on another's private conversations, and unauthorized examination of another's private papers and records. This form of invasion of privacy is committed once the intrusion occurs. To use the LICIDY is not required. My legal rights concerning the forced receipt of psychoactive drugs and possible surveillance fault-finding tactics employed by the enemies of my family. Condit. 1. Protection. As an American citizen. Condit, Smith, Len Young, and Richard and Nan and Barry S. Roberts. Business Law and the Regulation of Business. St. Paul, West Publishing Company, 1990. Page 109. Public disclosure of private facts. The law of privacy imposes liability for offensive publicity given to private information about another, or public disclosure of private facts. As with intrusion, this tort applies only to private, not public, information about an individual, but unlike intrusion, it requires publicity. Also, unlike defamation, this tort applies to truthful private information if the matter published would be offensive and objectionable to a reasonable person of ordinary sensibilities. Page 115-116. Consent to an act is the willingness that it shall occur and negates its wrongfulness. It may be shown expressly or impliedly, by words or by conduct. Consent must be given by an individual with capacity to do so. Consent given by a minor, mental incompetent, or intoxicated individual is invalid if he is not capable of understanding the nature, extent, or probable consequences of the conduct to which he has consented. 2. Protection. As a citizen of the United Nations. The Encyclopedia Americana. Volume 26. 1964. Education. Page 456. Charter of the United Nations and Statute of the International Court of Justice to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in the equal rights of men and women. Chapter I. Purposes and Principles. Article 1. To develop friendly relations among nations based on respect for the principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples, promoting and encouraging respect for human rights and for fundamental freedoms for all without distinction as to race, sex, language, or religion. B.I. You have no right to inflict psychological distress on my children. Watson, Robert I., and Henry Cleveland. Psychology of the Child. New York. John Wiley and Sons, Incorporated. 1973. Page 196. Maternal deprivation. Separation anxiety. The feeling of panic or acute depression that overwhelms an infant on the occasion of an unexpected or prolonged absence of the mother. Page 197. Partial deprivation refers to those children who, after establishing a satisfactory emotional relationship with the mother for the first 6 months of life, are thereafter frustrated by being separated from her. This is supposed to lead to a condition which Renee Spitz called analytic depression. Page 198. When these infants are older, although still within a range of childhood, they seem to be characterized by superficial relationships with other persons, lack of emotional responses in situations where it would be normal to display them, lack of concern about most matters, and pointless deceit and evasion. After examining the literature on maternal deprivation, under the aegis of the World Health Organization, John Bowlby 1951 wrote an eloquent defense of the thesis that an essential of mental health was the necessity for the infant to experience warm continuous relationship with the mother, the separation of Joe